The world watched one man for decades. They watched his movements. They heard his voice echo through stadiums. They witnessed his command over thousands of people. But what was happening inside his body, what was truly happening beneath that legendary stage presence, most people never bothered to understand. One man, not just a singer, a phenomenon. A person who redefined what it meant to be a performer. A person who made the impossible look effortless. A person whose voice became synonymous with power itself. But here's the real question. Was his extraordinary voice a result of his physical anatomy? Or was it something far more profound, an achievement of discipline, control, and sheer mastery? Why did he hide one of the most critical truths of his life? And more importantly, was it hiding, or was it survival? Did the world ever truly know Farrokh Bulsara, the person before Freddie Mercury, the legend? These three questions define his entire story. And if you stay with us until the end of this documentary, you'll finally understand the answers, not from gossip, not from speculation, but from evidence, science, and documented history. This is not just a music story. This is a story about identity, about a body pushed to its limits, about suffering hidden behind spectacle, about a human being caught between being a legend and simply trying to survive. His name was Freddie Mercury, and the truth about his life is far heavier than any myth the world created. To understand Freddie Mercury, we first have to forget we know who he was. Because before he was Freddie Mercury, before he commanded stadiums, before the world knew his name, there was a boy named Farrokh Bulsara. Born on September 5th, 1946, in Stone Town, Zanzibar. Not London, not New York, Zanzibar. His parents were Parsi, part of the Zoroastrian community, whose roots traced back to Persia, to ancient Persia. But his family had migrated to Zanzibar, where his father worked as a clerk for the British government. Think about that for a moment. The man the world would call the British rock legend, his origins were far more complex. Persian ancestry, Indian Parsi heritage, born on an African island, raised between continents. He was, from the very beginning, a person of multiple worlds. At age 8, his family sent him to boarding school in India's St. Peter's School in Panchgani. This is where something crucial happened. This is where Farrokh first discovered music. He learned piano there. He formed his first band. He began, without knowing it, to construct the person he would eventually become. But he didn't stay in India. In 1964, following political upheaval in Zanzibar, his family fled to England. Farrokh was 18 years old, a teenager caught between continents, between identities, between who he was and who he might become. He enrolled at Ealing Art College in London, where he studied graphic design and art. This detail matters. Most people don't know this. The man who would become one of rock music's greatest visual performers, he trained as a visual artist. He understood composition, design, the power of image, the impact of aesthetics. He was constructing himself, piece by piece. And then, sometime in the late 1960s, everything changed. He met Brian May and Roger Taylor, and together they would form a band. They needed a name. They chose Queen, a name that suggested royalty, power, androgyny, and rebellion all at once. And Farrokh Bulsara needed a new name too. He chose Freddie Mercury. This wasn't just a name change. This was self-creation. This was a young man from Zanzibar, from a Parsi family who had studied art and design, deliberately constructing a new identity, a new version of himself. A stage persona that would become so powerful, so iconic, that it would eventually overshadow the person underneath. When Freddie Mercury stepped on stage, something extraordinary happened. This wasn't just a singer. This was a force. His presence didn't compete with the venue, it consumed it. The stadium became his. Tens of thousands of people didn't watch him. They orbited around him. But what made him different? Everyone assumes it was his voice. And yes, his voice was exceptional. But as we'll discover, there's far more to the story than vocal cords and genetics. Between 1970 and the early 1980s, Freddie and Queen released some of rock music's most innovative work. Bohemian Rhapsody, a song that shouldn't have worked. An operatic rock fusion that was nearly 6 minutes long when radio was pushing 3-minute singles. It broke every rule and became iconic. We Are the Champions, an anthem of defiance and celebration. We Will Rock You. A song so simple, so powerful, that it made every stadium, every crowd, every listener complicit in its energy. These weren't just hits. They were cultural events. But what made Freddie's performances legendary wasn't just the music. It was the totality of it. His mic stand became an extension of his body. His movements were choreographed precision, mixed with apparent spontaneity. His costumes were art pieces. His interaction with the crowd wasn't performance, it was communion. He didn't sing to audiences. He performed with them. He led them. He commanded them. This is a crucial distinction. Thousands of singers can hit notes. Thousands of performers can command a stage for an hour. But Freddie Mercury did something rarer. He made people feel like they were part of something greater than themselves. He made them feel powerful. And that takes more than talent. That takes intelligence. That takes understanding human psychology. That takes absolute control over every element of performance. This is where Freddie's art school training mattered. This is where his understanding of design and composition came into play. He wasn't just entertaining, he was orchestrating. Now we arrive at one of the most persistent myths about Freddie Mercury, that his voice was somehow anatomically unique, that his body held some physical secret that explained his vocal power. For decades, people speculated. They talked about his teeth, his overbite, the shape of his mouth. They created elaborate theories about how his physical structure gave him superhuman vocal abilities. But here's what the science actually says. In 2016, a detailed acoustic analysis of Freddie Mercury's voice was published. This wasn't gossip. This was peer-reviewed research. And it revealed something surprising. Freddie Mercury was most likely a baritone, not the 4-octave spanning tenor that popular mythology suggested. His voice range, while remarkable, wasn't scientifically superhuman. So, what made it legendary? Control, technique, precision. Researchers discovered that his vibrato, the wavering quality in his voice, was unusually fast and irregular compared to classical singers. Because it means Freddie's greatness wasn't something he was born with. It was something he built, through discipline, through practice, through thousands of hours of understanding his instrument, his own body, with scientific precision. His voice wasn't magic, it was mastery. And this distinction matters, because it tells us something profound about Freddie himself. He wasn't a natural phenomenon that happened to exist. He was an artist who meticulously crafted every element of his performance. He understood the mechanics of his voice the way a violinist understands their instrument. So when we look at footage of him, when we see him command a stadium with what appears to be effortless power, we need to understand that effortlessness came from obsessive attention to detail. Nothing about Freddie Mercury was accidental. July 13th, 1985, Wembley Stadium, London. An estimated 72,000 people in the stadium. Over 1 billion watching on television worldwide. This was Live Aid, a global benefit concert. But it's remembered for one performance above all others. Freddie Mercury and Queen performed for approximately 20 minutes. And in those 20 minutes, they redefined what a live rock performance could be. This wasn't just a great concert. Professional musicians, critics, and historians still consider this the greatest live rock performance ever captured on film. Why? Freddie was in complete control. His energy was boundless. The crowd hung on his every gesture. His call and response with the audience was perfect. His timing was flawless. He used the entire stage as his canvas. But here's what makes this moment crucial to our story. At this moment, Freddie Mercury was at the absolute peak of his power. He was the most famous rock star in the world. He had achieved everything an artist could dream of. The crowd worshipped him. The music was perfect. The moment was transcendent. What nobody in that stadium knew, what almost nobody watching that broadcast understood, was that Freddie Mercury was already carrying something inside him that would, in just a few years, completely change his life. This performance, this legendary, perfect performance, would become the last great public moment of his career. What came after would be silence, struggle, a different kind of strength entirely. But in this moment, nobody knew. He was a god on that stage, and the world had no idea that gods can suffer too. By the late 1980s, Freddie Mercury began to withdraw from public life. This wasn't a choice. This was necessity. Medical records and historical documentation indicate that Freddie received an AIDS diagnosis sometime around 1987. But he never made it public. Year after year passed. He continued recording. He worked on music. But he did so in increasing privacy. Why would someone keep such a diagnosis secret? To understand this, you have to understand the 1980s and early 1990s. HIV and AIDS were not primarily medical crises in the public consciousness. They were moral crises. They were panic. They were stigma. LGBTQ+ individuals with AIDS weren't viewed with compassion. They were viewed with fear, judgment, and disgust. In many places, AIDS was discussed in language of punishment and morality. For a celebrity, especially a gay celebrity, a public AIDS diagnosis wasn't just a health issue. It was a weapon that media would use against you. It was headline fodder. It was the end of your career as you knew it. Freddie Mercury was the most famous rock star in the world. He had built an image. He had protected his privacy fiercely. The idea of releasing such personal medical information to a world that would weaponize it against him, that wasn't cowardice. That was survival. So he kept working. He recorded the album Innuendo in 1991, which would be Queen's final studio album with him. The title itself was a subtle reference to the unspoken crisis he was living through. He continued creating, but he was doing so while his body was waging a war that the world couldn't see. This is where the mythology breaks down. People imagine that celebrities are somehow different, that fame insulates them from suffering, that greatness protects them. But Freddie Mercury's body didn't care about his achievements. Disease doesn't negotiate with legend. He was fighting something invisible, something incurable at that time, while the world continued to demand his presence, his music, his energy. November 23, 1991. After years of silence, Freddie Mercury released a public statement. He confirmed that he was HIV positive. The world received a confirmation of what insiders had suspected for years. But here's the tragedy. He died the very next day. November 24, 1991. Bronchial pneumonia, complicated by AIDS. He was 45 years old. He spent years protecting his privacy from a world he knew would exploit it. And then, when he finally chose to be honest, when he finally decided that his truth mattered more than his silence, he had only one day left. One day. Think about that. The man who had spent a lifetime giving the world his voice, his energy, his presence, he didn't get to live with his own truth. He didn't get to experience the relief of honesty. But maybe, just maybe, that one day of truth was his final gift. Because when he died, the world could no longer pretend not to know. The world could no longer create comfortable narratives. It had to face the reality that even the greatest among us are human. Even legends get sick. Even immortals die. And the question we should ask ourselves is this: what did we miss by not understanding him sooner? How many years did we spend worshipping his image instead of seeing his humanity? How many times did we celebrate his performances without asking what it cost him? How much of his story did we never really understand? Freddie Mercury's story isn't about a secret hidden in his body. It's about the distance between image and reality. It's about a young man from Zanzibar who constructed himself into a legend, never imagining that the world would love the legend so much that they'd forget to see the person. It's about an artist who gave everything to his craft, who mastered his voice not through natural gift, but through discipline and control, and who paid the ultimate price for that mastery. It's about someone who suffered privately while performing publicly, and who the world judged not with compassion, but with curiosity. Here's what we know. Farrokh Bulsara became Freddie Mercury through sheer will and artistic genius. His voice was legendary, not because of anatomy, but because of mastery. His performances were transcendent because of intelligence and control. His suffering was hidden, not because he was ashamed, but because the world wasn't safe enough to be honest. And his truth finally spoken lasted only one day. But that one day changed everything. Because after Freddie Mercury's death, the world couldn't unsee what he had told us. We couldn't return to comfortable myths. We had to acknowledge that genius can suffer, that legends can be fragile, that the greatest performers among us might be fighting invisible battles. The real secret Freddie kept wasn't hidden in his body. It was hidden in the silence between the world's applause and the person underneath. And when that silence was finally broken, when he finally spoke his truth, the world realized it had been listening to a legend all along. But it had never truly heard the person.